In 2005, I had been doing reissues for about 13 years. I think it started in '92 with DCC. And I started thinking, I love these old recordings. I love them a lot, and it's fun to do reissues on them. It's an honor to do the Blue Note reissues that I've been doing. But wouldn't it be great to be able to get the vintage sound that we all love on a modern recording? What is it that made that vintage sound? Well, the first one, of course, is that the period that's normally considered the golden age of recording is mid-50s to the mid-60s. And in that era, everything was recorded vacuum tube. Solid state hadn't really come into the picture yet. The other thing is, most of the jazz recording at that time, and a lot of the classical recording, was being recorded direct to either mono or two-track stereo tape. In other words, it wasn't recorded multi-track and then mixed down. So you were avoiding a lot of degradation from multiple generations of copying. My idea was to build an all-valve recording system from microphones all the way to the disc cutting head. It took 15 years to accomplish this. I had no idea it was going to be that long. The microphones are clones of original microphones, some of the most popular mics from the era being the Neumann U47, the Neumann M49C, stereo Neumann SM2C. Also built some other mics that I haven't really used too much for this recording project. On the rest of the electronics, the mixer, and then later on the disc cutting electronics, I decided to bring things forward a little bit. I didn't want to feel locked into exactly what everybody was using from 1955 to 1965. A lot of improvements started to happen in the late 60s, even with tube gear. It didn't get used much for recording purposes. A classic example is the amplifiers that I'm using to drive the cutting head. They're Macintosh MI350s. That amplifier was introduced in 1968 and built up until 1972. They only made about 200 of them, and it's just an unbelievably great sounding power amplifier. It's a 350 watt monoblock amp, so I'm using a pair of those. Also, the tape machine that I chose is a Studer C37 quarter-inch two-track machine. It used a vacuum tube called the E188cc almost entirely throughout it, and I just loved the sound of that machine. I sort of set 1968 as the cutoff point for the development of gear. So the microphones are clones of the original mics. I didn't really mess around with their electronics very much. Tried to keep it true to the original. The mixer I designed completely from scratch. Didn't use anybody else's design on that. One of the hardest parts of the system was building the disc cutting part of it. I kind of looked at what everybody else did back in the tube era and thought I could actually do it a little bit better, a little simpler. That was quite a project and took a lot longer than I expected. I started that in 2009, but I didn't actually complete the disc cutting equipment until 2020. This is the heart and soul of the actual disc cutting system. It is the simplest possible path that you could come up with tubes. Neumann used 11 integrated circuits to do their disc cutting system, and my partner figured out how to do it with 4 discrete op amps. So I took that idea and basically ported the 4 discrete op amps into 4 vacuum tubes. I've compared it to what Westrex and Ortophone and everybody else did. It's a much simpler signal path, and I think the sound speaks for itself. In building these amplifiers, one of the things that I wanted to do that I've done is to get rid of all of the stuff that was on it for a hi-fi amplifier that I didn't want for an amplifier that's driving the cutter head. For instance, an input gain control. I don't want somebody to go over and tweak the input gain control, so that's gone. They also had switching for all of the different output impedances, everything from 1 ohm to 64 ohms that you might want to drive with it, which involved a switch and all these extra windings on the output of the transformer. So we eliminated that, and it has 1 winding, 9 ohms matched to the cutter head. Just to kind of show you what went into this, this is one of the main blocks. This has everything. It has the RIAA electronics. It has the feedback amplifier, There's feedback taken off of the cutter head to flatten out the frequency response. It requires its own amplifier. And then there's a combine amplifier that combines the main input and the feedback input. And then there's also the monitor section. So it has sort of the equivalent of a phono preamp also for playing back so that it's now RIA decoded. And then it also has the adjustments for the cutter head. This is called drive level, which actually sets the level on the disc. Feedback level, which affects the drive level, so they have to be adjusted separately. And then feedback monitor level, which is what you're listening to off the cutter head. This is the mastering console. It has all of the fun stuff that most mastering consoles have, including stepped level controls and 2 sets of them, so I can switch between them from track to track. Monitor switching for the various inputs and the modes, stereo, mono, left, right, and then tape or aux input, mono, stereo, etc. These are equalizers. Each one is actually a 4-channel equalizer because it has left and right main audio, and then also left and right for the preview information that feeds the computer, because if you're boosting bass going to the record, you have to boost bass going to the computer or it doesn't know. Each one is a 4-channel equalizer, and then I have 2 of them so that I can switch back and forth. When I switch A and B, it'll switch between them. And these are what a lot of people refer to as passive equalizers, meaning that the gain stage in it is just a simple single tube gain stage as makeup gain, because you can only have a passive filter. A passive equalizer would imply that it can boost, and you can't boost anything if you don't have an amplifier. But it gives me plus and minus 10 dB steps. They're set up like a graphic equalizer, but without the sliders. So it's 10 bands from 32 hertz to 16 kilohertz. I only chose to have 1 knob instead of 2 for left and right, figuring that 90% of the time you're EQing both channels the same. But if you wanted to EQ one channel differently, you just take that channel out. I can do one channel or the other channel or both when I do my boost and cut. This is a tube limiter based on the old LA2A Teletronics, but I'm only using the limiter function of the LA2A. I'm using my own tube line amp. And this is the gain stage for the entire console. This is a high frequency limiter for things like vocal sibilants, which you often need in disc cutting. This is actually an early version of the unit that was built by Ortophone, and it works beautifully, very transparent. These are preview meters and then the program meters that actually tell you what's going on to the disc. And then there's also peak meters here. And then the signal goes from there into the cutting amplifiers. This is the heart and soul of my recording system. This is my 8 microphone mixer. Instead of having pan pots like modern consoles have, this has the old-fashioned left, center, right switching for each microphone. And then an output adjust, which this is your 2-track, 2-channel output that would feed the tape machine. And then we have the normal metering, spectrum analyzer, 3rd octave. This I also built. It's the control room monitor and switching, so I can switch between the mixer, the output of the tape, or the output of this digital recorder. This digital recorder is here for an absolute backup, just in case I got a great take and something happened to the tape or a part of the tape or something. It's really good for giving the musicians in the studio an instant playback, because normally when you're recording to analog tape, you have to rewind the tape, find the beginning, play it for them. If they want to hear another section, you got to shuttle through it. And it's all kind of time consuming. And when you get to the end, you got to make absolutely sure that you're past the ending of the music before you punch back into record or you erase the end of the last take. So by going to digital, it eliminates all of that problem so they can get an instant playback, and it speeds the process up quite a bit. This is the Studer's C37 recorder playback deck. They were built from 1960 to 1970, all vacuum tube. This machine just has a sound that's amazing. It's a 2-track, 1/4-inch machine. Normally it would run at 15 inches per second, but because this is a 50 hertz machine and I'm running it on 60, the motor runs at 18 inches per second. And then when I play it back on my other Studer machine, I have a variable speed on it that allows me to adjust it so that I can get it nailed on. I think one of the things that is responsible for the great sound of this machine is it was one of the earliest machines ever to use a regulated power supply, and the regulation, of course, was done with tubes. And so there are 3 regulator tubes back there for the various voltages, and then there's a big power tube also that does the output for the regulation. It also, I guess you can see it, yeah, there's a light that comes on that's a ballast for the capstan motor. Yeah, one cute feature about this machine that's just so Swiss is they have automatic scissors to cut the tape. In order to be able to cut all tube, keep everything all tube, I need to use this machine because you need to have the preview head for cutting that doesn't exist on the recorder, plus the extra 2 playback electronics. So I'm still using the solid state electronics in here for preview, but the electronics below here are more of the Studer C37 electronics, and I have not only the 2 playback channels, but if you look underneath the grill behind it there, below it, there is the main power supply and the tube regulated power supply. So it's all C37 playback electronics, and all I have to do is unscrew the heads from these electronics and screw them in right here, and I'm ready to go. I finished the recording equipment short of the disc cutting part of it around 2017. We started looking for a place to record and hadn't really found anything that we were that happy about. In the interim, an interesting thing happened. A friend of mine named Rich Capeless back in New Jersey put together a website called rvglegacy.org. And on this website, he actually showed the plans for Rudy Van Gelder's studio that was built into his parents' house in Hackensack, New Jersey. And I looked at the plans for the studio and I was just flabbergasted because the size of the room was very similar to the room I have in the house that adjoins my mastering room here. With that knowledge, we decided to convert the living room, dining room area into a recording space. And we did all kinds of acoustic treatment. I bought a Steinway B piano, which is what Rudy had in his room. And I already had a Hammond C3 organ and a Leslie, so that went into the room. And we didn't duplicate his room or his layout, but we used it kind of as a guide. I should also make a point that it's not just Blue Note Rudy Van Gelder that we're trying to copy here. There were so many other great jazz recordings made, Columbia, Contemporary, I could go on and on. But they all had the tube vibe, they all had minimal miking. That was a huge thing. Rather than having 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 microphones on the drums or 2 or 3 microphones on the piano, most of the instruments were recorded with a single mic. Rather than recording the instruments in stereo, which means you really wind up with a lot of stereo images superimposed on top of one another so that you get, drums 10 feet wide and piano 10 feet wide. The microphone feeds were panned left, center, or right. The beauty of that, to me, is that you wind up with the piano in one place, the drums in one place, the saxophone in one place, like you would hear live music in a club. That was the way it was done back in the day, and that's what we're emulating. In October of 2021, we did our first sound test. We brought the musicians in, I set up the microphones, came back into the control room, opened up the microphones on the mixer, and the first words out of Dave's mouth is, "Wow, it sounds like a Blue Note." And I turn around and I'm high-fiving him, and we're all high-fiving because, we felt like we had really accomplished something. we're launching the label with our first release. It's by an artist named Kirsten Edkins. She's a sax player. It's a quartet with a quintet for like 3 of the tracks with trombone. So in December, we set up the recording session. We're very, very proud of the results. When Kirsten was listening to the final playbacks after the session ended, she gave me one of the greatest compliments I think I've ever been paid. She said, "This is the first recording I've ever done where I felt like the engineer was one of the musicians." That was a high praise indeed. It's recorded all valve from microphones to cutter head. It went straight to 2-track tape, all mixed live to the tape, and then it was cut directly from that tape. So we're very excited about our first release. There's a lot of studios in Hollywood that do great recording, but none of them are offering this. They're not all valve, they're not mixing straight to 2-track stereo tape and then putting that tape onto the phonograph record master. These are the master tapes for the album, Reel 1, Reel 2, Side 1, Side 2. When Kirsten and I first discussed doing the album together, once we had done a little sound test with 4 tracks, she asked me, she said, "Do you want to record a bunch of standards? Do you want new material? What do you want?" I said, "What would you like to do?" And she said, "Well, how about if we do like 1 standard and I'll do write some new material for it." I said, "That's great," because the 4 songs that she had presented to me in the sound test, 3 of those 4 were her compositions, which wound up on the final album. One thing that I probably should clarify is, there were a few podcasts where I've talked about the studio and how it all came about. But what I didn't really clarify is I didn't build this as a studio venture. I built it as a record label venture. So the studio is not for hire. It's for my projects. Our goal is to probably do 2 albums in the next year, and maybe a couple of years down the road, maybe get to about 4 records a year. This is the culmination of 15 years of work to get from a concept to reality. When I finished the recording, I was practically in tears because it was definitely a dream come true. My wife felt it too. She was sitting right here when we finished the record. She could see it in my face. It had taken 15 years to get from starting to build a microphone to having a complete album in the can, as it were, the tapes recorded. It was definitely a dream come true.